What if the story of humanity does not begin where we were taught it begins? What if the silence before recorded history is not emptiness, but a wound, a missing memory, a deliberate forgetting? There is something unsettling about the way every civilization speaks of an origin that follows a collapse, a flood, a fire, or a darkness. As if beginning itself is always an act of recovery rather than creation. And, before you let your body sink fully into this comfort, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if there is something in what I am whispering that makes you want to stay a little longer. If you wish, share the place and time where you are listening. I am always curious about the small points of light drifting together in the night. Human history, as it is commonly presented, begins cautiously. A few thousand years ago, agriculture, writing, cities. It is a tidy narrative, almost soothing in its simplicity, yet beneath that surface lies a tension that scholars rarely dwell on for long. Anatomically modern humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years. Complex cognition, symbolic thought, and social organization did not suddenly appear alongside clay tablets. And yet the official memory of civilization wakes up late, as if from a deep sleep, with no clear recollection of what came before. Across continents that never touched, ancient cultures left behind the same uneasy admission. There was a time before this one, a time that ended badly. Sumerian texts speak of kings who reigned for impossible spans of time before a flood swept the world clean. In Mesoamerica, cycles of suns rise and fall, each ending in destruction. In India, the yugas turn like a wheel, grinding entire ages into dust. These are often dismissed as myth, metaphor, or primitive attempts to explain natural disasters. But the consistency of the pattern is difficult to ignore. Collapse precedes memory. Reset precedes order. Even the ground beneath our feet carries traces of interruption. Geologists read the earth like a palimpsest, layers written over layers, each one ending abruptly. Ice ages arrive suddenly. Sea levels rise with terrifying speed. Entire ecosystems vanish, not gradually, but violently. The Younger Dryas, a period that should not have happened according to older climate models, arrives like a slammed door, plunging the planet back into cold just as it was warming. Human populations scatter, adapt, or disappear. When warmth returns, civilization does not simply resume, it restarts differently. There is a quiet discomfort in acknowledging that progress is fragile. That knowledge does not accumulate smoothly, but shatters, scatters, and sometimes never reassembles in the same shape. Tools become relics. Skills become legend. Structures become inexplicable. Stone monuments stand where no society should have had the means to build them, aligned to stars whose positions were known long before telescopes. The question is not whether ancient people were clever. It is whether we have underestimated how much they once knew and how much was lost. Official history prefers continuity. It prefers linear growth, manageable timelines, and clear causality. Resets complicate that. Resets imply failure on a civilizational scale. They suggest that humanity has reached peaks before and fallen from them, leaving only fragments embedded in myth, architecture, and ritual. To accept that is to accept vulnerability, not just in the past, but now. And so a deeper question begins to form, almost uninvited. If civilizations have ended before, not once but repeatedly, what protected the memory of those who came after? Who decided what was preserved and what dissolved into story? Was forgetting merely the result of catastrophe, or did someone at some point choose to close the archive? Because if this is not the first world humanity has built, then it is not the first to believe itself permanent. And somewhere in the silence before our recorded beginning, something may still be waiting to be remembered. The silence left behind by the first collapse does not feel empty for long. It begins to hum with contradictions. If something truly ended, why are there so many echoes that refuse to fade? the question that lingers from before slowly sharpens here. Was the earliest reset merely a story told by frightened descendants, or does the planet itself still carry the scar of a world that vanished too quickly to be remembered properly? Long before written history, the Earth records an interruption that does not behave like an ordinary climatic shift. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica show sudden temperature drops so abrupt they resemble a mistake in the data. Layers of sediment across the northern hemisphere reveal a strange mixture of charcoal, microscopic spherules, and shocked minerals, materials often associated with immense heat and violent energy release. The Younger Dryas, as this interval came to be called, begins roughly 12,000 years ago, almost overnight in geological terms. What should have been a gradual warming snaps back into cold, locking the planet into another millennium of harsh instability. For those who lived through it, this would not have felt like a climate trend. It would have felt like the sky turning against the Earth. Glaciers surged, sea level stalled and then rose unpredictably. Entire regions that had supported human settlement became uninhabitable within generations. Archaeological layers from this period show abrupt abandonment. Campsites vanish. Tool traditions change suddenly, as if knowledge chains were broken and reassembled by survivors who no longer remembered how things used to be done. What complicates the picture is timing. The end of the Younger Dryas aligns uncomfortably well with flood traditions found almost everywhere humans later recorded memory. From Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, from China to the Americas, stories speak of water erasing a previous age. These are not gentle inundations. They are described as total. Mountains drown, ancestors perish. A few are spared, not because they are strongest, but because they are chosen, warned, or instructed to preserve fragments of life and knowledge. It is easy to say that floods happen, and humans remember them dramatically. Yet the shared structure of these narratives hints at something deeper. They do not describe local disasters. They describe a world reset. Civilization ends, not just settlements. Moral order collapses alongside physical structures. Afterward, society does not resume. It begins again under new rules. Geology adds another unsettling layer. Meltwater pulses at the end of the last ice age caused sea levels to rise by tens of meters, swallowing coastlines where early human populations likely concentrated. If complex societies had emerged along these fertile shores, their remains would now lie far beneath the ocean. Stone tools and bones might survive, but wood, textiles, and symbolic materials would dissolve, leaving little to prove complexity ever existed. Absence becomes misinterpreted as innocence. Some researchers have cautiously explored more dramatic possibilities. Hypotheses involving comet fragments or cosmic debris impacting the Earth around the onset of the Younger Dryas have circulated for years, debated and criticised, but never fully dismissed. The evidence is incomplete, contested, yet persistent enough to remain uncomfortable. An external shock would explain the suddenness. It would also explain why cultures across the globe encode catastrophe, not as a slow decline, but as an overwhelming event descending from above. If a technologically or socially advanced human culture existed before this rupture, its downfall would have been nearly total. Survivors would not pass down blueprints or engineering manuals. They would pass down warnings, rituals, and stories. Knowledge would compress into myth, because myth travels farther and survives longer than precision. Over generations, practical understanding would fade, leaving only symbolic echoes of what was once functional truth. This reframing alters the way ancient monuments are perceived. Structures that appear anomalously old or sophisticated may not belong to the civilizations credited with them. They may be inheritances, repaired, reinterpreted, and reused by cultures who found them already standing. The builders become gods or ancestors in memory, not because they were supernatural, but because they belonged to a time no one could reach. The first reset, then, may not mark the birth of civilization, but the erasure of its earliest form, a boundary where continuity snaps and human history is forced to restart with reduced memory and diminished reach. The world after the catastrophe would feel haunted, landscapes altered, ruins partially buried, survivors living among remnants they did not fully understand. And still, an unease remains. If the catastrophe was so complete, why do certain fragments align so precisely across cultures that never contacted each other? Why do myths, calendars, and symbolic systems preserve similar shapes of loss? Perhaps because the event was global, or perhaps because someone somewhere believed it was essential that future generations never forget that the world can end suddenly without warning. If the first reset was written into ice, stone, and story, then it was not the last time humanity learned this lesson. And if this knowledge survived at all, it suggests that some observers understood the pattern well enough to prepare for its return. The question that now emerges quietly is not whether a civilization ended, but who noticed the cycle forming and what they chose to do with that understanding before the next break arrived. The idea of a single catastrophe is unsettling enough, yet what follows is stranger still. After the cold receded and the waters withdrew, humanity did not simply rebuild where it had been. Instead, it appeared to scatter, reorganize, and leave behind signs of a knowledge that did not quite fit the societies remembered in textbooks. The contradiction left unresolved before now begins to press harder. Why do the earliest monumental sites emerge not at the peak of early civilization, but at its apparent dawn? In southeastern Anatolia, massive stone enclosures rise from a hill that should never have held them. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture, writing, and permanent urban life by millennia. Its builders were, by conventional definition, hunter-gatherers, and yet they quarried, transported, and carved multi-ton pillars with refined symbolic language, precise geometry, and a sense of cosmic orientation. The reliefs etched into stone show animals, abstract forms, and figures that feel more like inherited symbols than spontaneous invention. This was not experimentation, it was execution. What makes this site unsettling is not only its age, but its intent. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, not abandoned, not destroyed. Carefully entombed beneath the layers of earth, as if its builders knew it was no longer meant to be used, but also not meant to be forgotten. The act feels ceremonial, even protective. It raises a quiet question. Why would a supposedly primitive society seal away its most ambitious construction at the very moment civilization was said to be beginning? Elsewhere, similar anomalies surface. In Europe, megalithic structures align with solstices and lunar cycles that require long-term observation and precise record-keeping. Stonehenge is only the most famous among thousands of stone circles whose purposes remain debated, but whose astronomical awareness is undeniable. These structures appear before metallurgy, before complex states, and before formal mathematics as we define it. Knowledge seems to arrive fully formed, not incrementally assembled. This pattern suggests inheritance rather than invention. A population emerging from catastrophe would not begin with trial and error. It would begin with memory fragments, partial instructions, ritualized behaviors that once served practical ends. Over time, meaning would blur, but form would persist. The monument becomes sacred not because it is new, but because it is old beyond recall. Archaeology often frames early humans as gradually discovering farming, architecture, and astronomy. Yet the timeline refuses to behave neatly. Agriculture appears suddenly in multiple regions with no clear developmental trail. Domesticated plants arrive optimized, not tentative. The same is true of animal husbandry. These leaps are often explained as convergent innovation, but convergence does not account for speed. It does not explain why knowledge clusters appear almost simultaneously after long periods of apparent stagnation. One possibility rarely explored openly, is that survivors of a prior world carried compressed knowledge into a diminished future. Without population density, infrastructure or stability, complex systems could not be sustained. What could survive were principles, not practices, orientation to the sky, seasonal markers, architectural proportions tied to cycles of time. These would be preserved not in schools or libraries but in ritual and stone. The absence of writing from this era is often used as evidence against complexity. Yet writing is fragile. It requires continuity. In a world still reeling from collapse, oral transmission would dominate. Memory would be encoded in story, rhythm, repetition, and ceremony. Over generations, precision would erode, but the skeleton of knowledge would remain. There is also the matter of scale. Many early monumental sites are not modest. They demand coordinated labour, planning, and leadership. This implies social structures capable of mobilisation. Either such structures arose far more quickly than expected, or they were remnants of an older organisational memory. A people who had once known cities would understand coordination, even if they could no longer build cities themselves. What emerges here is not a picture of humanity slowly crawling towards civilization, but of humanity recovering from amnesia. Civilization does not ignite, it reconstitutes. Each new centre feels less like a beginning and more like a restart constrained by loss. The second reset, then, may not have erased everything. It may have reduced humanity to a quieter, more cautious state, one that remembered danger too well to rush forward. Monuments become anchors, fixed points in time, warnings carved in stone, aligned to the heavens, reminding future generations that the world moves in cycles larger than any single lifetime. And still, another tension remains unresolved. If these structures were inheritances, who first built them? If their builders were not the societies credited with them, then their true origin lies further back, beyond even the earliest archaeological layers we can easily access. Perhaps the stones are not messages from gods, but from humans who understood that memory fades faster than stone. And perhaps they hoped that when the next rebuilding began, someone would notice that civilization does not rise once, but many times, always from the rubble of something that came before. What follows the survival of stone is the survival of something far more fragile, not structures but instructions, not buildings but directions. The unresolved tension now shifts quietly from what endured to how it travelled forward. If knowledge was broken and scattered, how did fragments of it resurface centuries later in places that should not have remembered anything at all? There exists a category of historical artifact that does not announce itself loudly. It does not appear as a ruin or a monument. It arrives folded, drawn, copied, and recopied. Maps belong to this category. They pretend to be practical, yet sometimes they reveal far more than they should. In the early 16th century, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world map using sources he claimed were already ancient. The surviving fragment of that map depicts coastlines with unsettling confidence. Parts of South America appear accurately rendered long before modern surveying. More disturbing still are claims that the southern landmass resembles Antarctica without ice. These claims are debated, challenged, and often dismissed, and yet the discomfort does not vanish entirely. Even if later interpretations exaggerate the precision, the underlying question remains untouched. From where did the source material originate? Piri Reis himself did not pretend to be an innovator. He described his work as an assembly of older maps, some inherited, some captured, some copied from traditions already fading. The map feels less like a discovery and more like a transmission. Maps require reference points. They demand a world view in which the Earth is measured, not imagined. Latitude, longitude, proportional distance. These are not intuitive concepts. They are learned systems. If fragments of such systems existed long before the eras credited with their invention, then someone, somewhere, had already solved these problems once. This possibility casts a strange light on the role of ancient centres of knowledge. Institutions like the Library of Alexandria are often romanticised as vaults of forgotten wisdom. But perhaps they were something more precarious. Not origins of knowledge, but bottlenecks. Places where fragments from many lost worlds briefly converged before being filtered, summarised, or lost again. If resets had already occurred, then Alexandria was not collecting the past, but the remains of multiple pasts layered atop one another. The destruction of such centres is typically framed as tragedy, fire, war, neglect. Yet there is another interpretation that lingers uncomfortably. When knowledge accumulates without context, it becomes dangerous. Not because it empowers, but because it misleads. Techniques divorced from the conditions that made them viable can destabilise societies attempting to apply them blindly. Perhaps some losses were not accidents, but corrections. After catastrophe, continuity becomes suspect. The survivors who carry fragments forward must choose what to preserve and what to let dissolve into myth. In doing so, they shape the next civilization's understanding of reality itself. A navigational principle becomes a story about a god guiding travellers. A mathematical ratio becomes sacred proportion. An astronomical cycle becomes a ritual calendar. The function disappears, the form remains. Over time, societies begin to believe that what they inherited was always symbolic, never technical. The idea that ancestors possessed practical knowledge beyond current understanding becomes uncomfortable. It challenges hierarchy. It suggests regression rather than progress. And so, explanations are adjusted, myths are demoted, artifacts are reclassified. Anything that does not fit the linear ascent of civilization is pushed sideways into the realm of coincidence or imagination. Yet certain artifacts resist this treatment. Ancient maps are among them because they can be tested. Coastlines can be compared, distances measured. When they align too well, explanations strain. It becomes easier to argue that the mapmaker guessed correctly than to ask whether the mapmaker copied something far older than anyone wishes to admit. This introduces a subtle shift in perspective. Perhaps after the second reset, humanity did not rebuild blindly. Perhaps it navigated by faint signals left behind intentionally. Not explicit instructions, but breadcrumbs. Enough to orient, not enough to restore what was lost. A controlled inheritance. If so, then the third phase of human history is not a renaissance, but a narrowing. Knowledge becomes specialized, guarded, and eventually institutionalized. Only certain forms are allowed to persist openly. Others are absorbed, neutralized, or reframed until they no longer threaten the dominant narrative of steady improvement. The maps, the measurements, the inexplicable accuracies. They may be the last honest witnesses of a world that understood itself differently. A world that knew collapse was possible, perhaps inevitable, and chose to whisper rather than shout across time. And if that whisper survived floods, ice, and centuries of reinterpretation, then it suggests intention. Someone expected the cycle to continue. Someone believed that memory alone, even fractured, could outlast another reset. The unease deepens here, because if fragments were passed down deliberately, then someone once stood at the edge of disappearance and decided not everything should be saved. The question that drifts forward now is not what was lost, but who made the decision about what future humanity would be allowed to remember. After maps and monuments, another contradiction surfaces quietly, almost shyly. It concerns absence. The long stretches of history, often labelled as darkness, feel less like empty corridors and more like rooms with the lights deliberately turned off. The unresolved question drifting from before now sharpens. If fragments of advanced understanding survived catastrophe, why do so many centuries appear to forget how to think altogether? The term Dark Age suggests collapse followed by ignorance. Yet darkness is rarely uniform. In many regions, periods described this way still produced intricate metalwork, sophisticated oral law, precise calendars, and complex social hierarchies. What disappeared was not intelligence, but visibility. Written records thin out, monumental construction slows, knowledge retreats from public display and sinks into smaller, quieter containers. Monasteries, mystery schools, guilds, and closed traditions begin to dominate the preservation of skill. This is not accidental. Writing, once it becomes centralized, becomes controllable. To write history is to decide which memory is allowed permanence. In the centuries following major collapses, literacy often contracts instead of expands. Texts are copied selectively. Languages simplify or fracture. What survives does so because it serves stability, not curiosity. This pattern appears repeatedly. After the fall of Rome, for example, engineering knowledge did not vanish overnight. Roads still existed, aqueducts still functioned, but the institutional memory required to replicate them faded. The techniques became relics rather than templates. Those who inherited the structures learned to live inside them, not to rebuild them. The past became infrastructure, not instruction. At the same time, symbolic systems flourished. Religious cosmologies grew dense. Sacred geometry appeared in architecture. Chant, rhythm, and repetition became tools of preservation. Sound outlasted script. Gesture outlasted diagram. In cultures where writing contracted, memory became embodied. Knowledge lived in bodies trained to repeat, not in pages meant to explain. This shift suggests a defensive posture. After repeated resets, civilizations may have learned that open dissemination of powerful knowledge invites instability. Tools can be misused. Techniques can accelerate destruction. By embedding understanding within ritual and allegory, societies could preserve essence without exposing mechanism. Outsiders would see myth. Initiates would sense pattern. Alchemy, astrology, and sacred mathematics emerge in this context not as pseudoscience, but as camouflage. Practical insights about chemistry, metallurgy, and astronomy are encoded symbolically, safe from those who might apply them recklessly. Meaning is layered. On the surface, stories. Beneath, structure. Only those willing to linger learn how to read between lines. This helps explain why so many traditions insist that truth must be earned, not given. Initiation replaces instruction. Secrecy replaces publication. In a world repeatedly burned by its own reach, caution becomes virtue. The idea that everyone deserves access to everything would have seemed reckless to survivors who remembered collapse firsthand. The narrowing of knowledge also creates power. Those who control memory control continuity. Religious institutions, imperial courts, and scholarly elites become gatekeepers, not merely of belief, but of possibility. This is not always sinister. Stability requires limits. Yet over time, limits harden into doctrine. Doctrine replaces inquiry. What was once protection becomes suppression. This transition is subtle. No single decree announces the closing of the archive. Instead, texts are deemed heretical. Questions become dangerous. Curiosity is reframed as hubris. The world is presented as complete, its mysteries resolved by authority rather than explored through experience. In this environment, history itself becomes a tool of governance. The past is shortened, timelines compress. Anything too old becomes myth by default. Anything too advanced becomes anachronism. By controlling what counts as real, institutions insulate the present from unsettling comparisons. Civilization is no longer a cycle, but a ladder, with the current rung presented as the highest. Yet cracks remain. Esoteric diagrams survive in manuscripts copied by hands that may not fully understand them. Folk traditions preserve astronomical alignments in festival calendars. architectural proportions, echo-mathematical relationships whose origins are never explained. Knowledge does not vanish, it fragments and hides. The persistence of these fragments suggests intentional design. Someone, somewhere, decided that remembering everything was too dangerous, that forgetting selective and structured was safer. The Dark Ages, then, are not dark because nothing existed, but because visibility was rationed. This reframing casts earlier resets in a new light. Catastrophe may shatter civilization, but survival strategies shape what follows. After enough cycles, humanity learns not only how to rebuild, but how to constrain itself. Progress becomes conditional. Memory becomes guarded. Advancement is allowed only within boundaries deemed safe, and yet restraint carries its own risk. When knowledge is hidden too well, later generations forget why the boundaries exist. Rituals lose context. Symbols become decoration. What was once a warning becomes a superstition. Eventually, curiosity returns without caution. Tools are rediscovered without the memory of why they were once hidden. The tension that now lingers is quiet but heavy. If the Dark Ages were not voids but vaults, then someone still holds the keys. And if knowledge was once deliberately dimmed to protect the future, what happens when the future forgets it was ever protected at all? A quiet unease now settles over the pattern that has been forming. Catastrophe explains loss. Survival explains fragmentation. But neither fully accounts for direction. The unresolved tension drifts toward a more uncomfortable possibility, that some resets were not only endured, but guided. That alongside floods, ice, and famine, there existed decisions, human decisions, about what the next world should be allowed to know. History often speaks of power as something that arises after stability returns. Yet power can also emerge in moments of collapse, when confusion makes authority feel necessary. After a reset, people do not ask for freedom. They ask for order. Whoever provides coherence becomes trusted. Whoever tells a convincing story about why the world broke gains the right to define how it should be rebuilt. This is where institutions begin to matter. Not as villains, but as structures that outlast individuals. Religious hierarchies, imperial bureaucracies, and early scholarly canons do not merely preserve memory. They filter it. They decide which narratives are safe to repeat, and which must be softened, allegorized, or erased. Over time, these choices harden into tradition, and tradition begins to look like truth. Consider how often history is rewritten not after discovery, but after consolidation. When empires rise, they do not merely conquer territory. They reorganize time. Calendars change. Genealogies are edited. Foundational myths are standardized. The past becomes cleaner, shorter, and more useful. Anything that suggests previous cycles of advanced civilization complicates legitimacy. If greatness existed before, then current rulers are not inevitable. They are temporary. The control of chronology is especially telling. By compressing timelines, institutions make the present feel unprecedented. Humanity appears young. Progress appears rapid. The idea that knowledge might have peaked before and fallen away becomes unthinkable. A linear story is easier to govern than a cyclical one because cycles imply return and eventual decline. Some ancient traditions resisted this compression quietly. They preserved long counts, great years, and cosmic cycles that stretched far beyond official histories. These systems did not fit neatly into emerging orthodoxies. They implied that worlds end and begin repeatedly, indifferent to kings and creeds. Unsurprisingly, such ideas were often marginalized, reinterpreted or absorbed into symbolic frameworks stripped of their original implications. It is not necessary to imagine a single secret council orchestrating forgetting. Systems do not require intent to produce consistent outcomes. Once knowledge becomes dangerous to authority, suppression becomes self-reinforcing. Scholars self-censor, scribes copy selectively, teachers simplify. Over generations, what began as caution becomes orthodoxy. What began as protection becomes denial. There's also the matter of access. Literacy, education, and preservation require resources. After resets, resources concentrate. Those who control food, land, and security naturally control learning. Knowledge becomes privilege. Privilege becomes tradition. Eventually, the idea that only certain people should understand the deeper structure of reality feels natural rather than imposed. This dynamic blurs the line between survival strategy and manipulation. Limiting knowledge may prevent reckless use of powerful tools, but it also prevents collective wisdom. When too few remember the reasons behind restraint, restraint itself becomes arbitrary. The story of collapse is forgotten, leaving only rules without context. The subtlety of this process is what makes it so difficult to confront. There is no moment where history announces it has been edited. There are only absences, missing manuscripts, interrupted architectural lineages, techniques that appear fully formed and then vanish, questions that stop being asked not because they are answered, but because they are no longer permitted. Over centuries, these absences accumulate until the past begins to look simpler than the present. Humanity appears to emerge from ignorance rather than retreat into it. The notion that entire frameworks of understanding could be lost becomes implausible. And so, when evidence surfaces that challenges this simplicity, it is labelled fringe, speculative, or dangerous, not because it lacks merit, but because it destabilises the story that keeps the present coherent. If this interpretation holds even partially, then some resets were not only geological or climatic, they were epistemological. Ways of knowing were dismantled, replaced with narrower systems better suited to control and continuity. Civilization did not merely restart, it was redesigned. This reframing casts a long shadow forward. It suggests that what we call history is not a neutral record, but a curated inheritance shaped by fear of repetition. Fear that if humanity remembers too much, it will attempt too much. Fear that cycles, once recognized, might be accelerated rather than avoided. And so the question that lingers at the edge of this part is unsettling in its restraint. If knowledge was once deliberately limited to prevent another collapse, what happens when that limit itself becomes invisible? When the reasons for forgetting are forgotten? When humanity begins, once again, to reach outward without remembering how many times it has already fallen? The pattern has now grown too dense to ignore. Loss alone cannot explain it. Control alone cannot explain it either. What begins to surface instead is a quieter mechanism, one that operates beneath catastrophe and authority alike. It concerns the role of the witness, not the ruler, not the survivor, but the one who records, the one who decides what counts as having happened. Every civilization inherits not only ruins and rituals, but narrators, scribes, priests, chroniclers, historians. These figures are often portrayed as passive mirrors of their time, faithfully capturing events as they unfold. Yet no mirror reflects everything. Angle matters, light matters, choice matters. And when memory is scarce, the one who writes becomes the architect of reality. After each reset, the number of witnesses shrinks. Survivors are fewer. Records are fewer. The gap between event and recollection widens. In that gap, interpretation settles like dust. What was once experienced becomes retold. What was retold becomes formalized. What was formalized becomes unquestionable. This is not deception. It is compression. Complexity collapses under the weight of transmission. In oral cultures, this compression follows rhythm and repetition. In literate cultures, it follows selection. Not every event is written down. Not every text is copied. Not every copy survives. Over time, survival masquerades as importance. What remains is assumed to matter most. What disappears is assumed never to have mattered at all. This creates a feedback loop. Later historians build frameworks based only on what they can see. They reconstruct causes from consequences. Absence becomes evidence of absence. The possibility that entire chapters of human experience could have unfolded without leaving durable traces becomes increasingly uncomfortable, because it undermines the authority of the archive itself. There is also the problem of language. Each reset fractures speech. Meanings drift. Symbols detach from original reference. Words that once described processes come to describe gods. Terms that once encoded measurements become poetry. When later readers encounter these texts, they assume metaphor where there was once instruction. They assume imagination where there was once observation. This is especially true of ancient cosmologies. Descriptions of cycles, destructions, and renewals are treated as spiritual allegory rather than experiential memory. The idea that ancestors might have encoded real events into mythic language is often acknowledged in theory, but resisted in practice. To take it seriously would require admitting that modern frameworks are not the first to attempt coherence. The witness problem intensifies when authority enters the scene. Once a dominant narrative is established, alternative accounts become liabilities. They introduce uncertainty. They threaten unity. Over time, witnesses who deviate are labelled unreliable, heretical, or dangerous. Their records are ignored, destroyed, or reinterpreted until they align with the accepted story. History narrows, not because truth vanishes, but because divergence becomes intolerable. This narrowing is rarely malicious. It arises from the desire for stability. Societies recovering from collapse crave certainty. They need a story that explains suffering without reopening it. Cyclical narratives, which imply future collapse, are deeply unsettling. Linear narratives, which promise improvement, soothe. The witness who reinforces hope is rewarded. The witness who warns of repetition is sidelined. And so the record bends gently toward optimism. Each reset is reframed as progress. Each loss becomes a necessary step. Each forgotten capability is dismissed as myth. The idea that humanity might be circling rather than climbing becomes almost obscene. Better to believe that this time is different. Yet traces of dissenting witnesses persist. They appear as contradictions in the record, as sudden leaps without precursors, as technologies that seem to arrive fully formed, as calendars that stretch far beyond the accepted age of the world. These are not proof of lost civilizations. They are symptoms of incomplete memory. The deeper unease lies in recognizing that witnesses are not only ancient, they exist now. Modern historians, scientists, archivists, these are the current narrators. They too operate under constraints: funding, ideology, peer consensus, institutional pressure. None of these require conspiracy to shape outcome. They only require alignment. Over time, certain questions stop being asked because they lead nowhere socially, even if they remain unresolved intellectually. This continuity between past and present is what gives the pattern its weight. The mechanism that filtered memory after previous resets may still be active, not because anyone intends erasure, but because systems favour coherence over curiosity. The witness learns what can be said safely. Silence becomes professionalism. If this is true, then history is not merely what happened. It is what survived narration, and narration is always selective. The idea that 6 resets occurred before now may never be provable in the traditional sense. The witnesses who could have confirmed it would have been among the first lost, but the absence of witnesses does not erase the shape of what they once saw. It lingers in anomalies, in the discomfort scholars feel when timelines strain, in the recurring sense that humanity's story begins too late and ends too often. As this realization settles, another question quietly forms. If the past was shaped by witnesses who chose what to remember, then the future will be shaped by the witnesses of this age. And whether the next reset is remembered as accident, inevitability, or warning may depend less on what happens than on who is allowed to speak when it does. By now, the cycle feels almost visible, like a shadow moving beneath the surface of time. Yet shadows require light to exist, and here the light comes from an unexpected direction. Not myth, not monuments, not manuscripts, but measurement. The unresolved tension drifts towards science itself, where numbers and instruments, meant to stabilize reality, begin to hint at repetition rather than progress. When modern researchers began reconstructing Earth's climatic past in detail, they did not expect to find rhythm. They expected noise, gradual change, punctuated by rare anomalies. Instead, patterns emerged. Ice cores revealed oscillations, sharp rises and falls that did not behave gently. Ocean sediments told similar stories, layers corresponding to warmth, then cold, then warmth again, each transition sometimes unfolding within a single human lifetime. What is unsettling is not simply that climate changes, but how abruptly it does so. The planet appears capable of switching states faster than social systems can adapt. These shifts correlate with mass extinctions, population bottlenecks, and cultural disruptions. Human societies do not merely suffer during these moments. They reorganize, they simplify, they forget. Astronomy adds another layer. Earth does not move through space alone. It travels through a dynamic environment shaped by gravitational cycles, solar variability, and cosmic debris. Periodic increases in radiation, shifts in solar output, and encounters with dense regions of interstellar material have all been proposed as contributing factors to climatic instability. None of these hypotheses alone explains everything. Together, they suggest vulnerability. The idea that civilization might be periodically reset by forces beyond human control is uncomfortable. It undermines the notion that collapse is always self-inflicted or moral in nature. It reframes catastrophe not as punishment or failure, but as environmental reality. This perspective appears repeatedly in ancient cosmologies that speak not of a single apocalypse, but of recurring ends. What modern science contributes is timing. Several extinction events and cultural disruptions cluster suspiciously close to known climatic or cosmic anomalies. This does not prove causation. It does, however, raise the possibility that human history is synchronized, at least loosely, with planetary rhythms far larger than any society. If so, then each reset would not be random. It would be expected, not predictable in detail, but inevitable in principle. Civilizations would rise during stable windows and fracture when conditions shift beyond tolerance. Over thousands of years, survivors would internalize this pattern intuitively, encoding it into myth, ritual, and calendar systems. This reframes ancient warnings, stories of gods withdrawing favor, of heavens darkening, of stars behaving strangely. These may not be superstition, but pre-scientific language for real environmental stressors. Without instruments, observation becomes narrative. Without equations, pattern becomes story. Modern science, for all its precision, faces a similar limitation. Models grow complex, variables multiply, confidence intervals widen. At certain scales, certainty dissolves. The future becomes probabilistic rather than planned. In this space, ancient cyclical thinking begins to feel less primitive and more pragmatic. There is also the matter of technological fragility. Each successive civilization becomes more complex, more interconnected, and therefore more sensitive to disruption. A climatic shift that might inconvenience a decentralized society can cripple a globalized one. Dependence amplifies vulnerability. Resilience declines even as capability increases. This introduces a sobering thought. Perhaps earlier civilizations, having endured resets, intentionally limited their complexity. Perhaps they understood that efficiency and scale carry hidden costs. The choice to embed knowledge in stone and story rather than in machines and networks may have been adaptive, not regressive. If this is true, then the scientific anomalies we now debate are not just curiosities. They are signals, not warnings in a moral sense, but reminders of context. Civilization does not exist above nature. It exists within it, subject to cycles that do not negotiate. And yet modern narratives resist this framing. The idea that collapse could be natural feels like surrender. It suggests that progress cannot outpace environment indefinitely. It challenges the belief that intelligence alone guarantees survival. To accept cycles is to accept limits. Still, the evidence accumulates quietly. Climate proxies align, astronomical models repeat, geological layers echo. The pattern does not insist, it waits. The unresolved question that moves forward now is delicate. If resets are woven into the fabric of Earth's interaction with space and climate, then memory becomes humanity's only defense. Not memory of dates and names, but memory of fragility, memory of recurrence. And if that memory has been repeatedly lost, not through malice but through disruption itself, then each new civilization begins with optimism and ends with surprise. The cycle continues, not because it must, but because it is rarely recognized in time. As this realization settles, it becomes difficult to see the present as exceptional. Instead, it begins to feel familiar. Another warm window, another surge of complexity, another moment when humanity believes it has finally outrun the past. Whether this belief is insight or illusion remains unanswered, but the rhythm beneath it grows harder to ignore, and with each new measurement, the silence between resets feels less like peace and more like a pause. As the rhythm becomes clearer, another shift occurs quietly in perspective. The question is no longer whether civilizations have ended before, but where that leaves those living now. The unresolved tension turns inward. If cycles govern rise and collapse, then humanity may not be the author of history so much as its latest inheritor. There is a subtle arrogance embedded in the idea of origin. To believe oneself first is to believe oneself exceptional. Modern culture rests heavily on this assumption. Humanity emerges from primitive struggle, climbs steadily, and finally arrives at awareness. Everything before is preparation. Everything after is destiny. Yet cycles dissolve destiny into repetition. They reduce novelty to timing. Genetic evidence adds an uncomfortable note to this reflection. Studies of human populations reveal repeated bottlenecks, moments when numbers dropped drastically, compressing diversity into a narrow stream of survivors. These events leave signatures in DNA, quiet confirmations that humanity has been close to disappearance more than once. Each time, survival was not guaranteed. Each time, the future depended on a fragile thread. What followed these bottlenecks was not uniform recovery. Some populations retained skills, others lost them. Technology did not spread evenly. Knowledge fragmented geographically. The image that emerges is not of a single march forward, but of many parallel experiments, most of which failed or stalled. In this light, the idea of being the seventh civilization does not imply a clean count. It is a metaphor for position rather than number. A recognition that modern global civilization may occupy the same structural role others once did, benefiting from inherited stability while assuming permanence. This reframing shifts the emotional center of history. Instead of triumph, there is inheritance. Instead of inevitability, there is contingency. The present becomes less a culmination and more a temporary configuration, shaped by favourable conditions that could reverse without asking permission. Archaeology hints at this humility in unexpected ways. Tools and techniques once dismissed as crude are reconsidered as optimised for resilience rather than speed. Mobile societies leave fewer traces, but they survive disruption better than dense urban centres. Knowledge embedded in daily practice persists longer than knowledge stored in centralised archives. Perhaps earlier civilizations understood this trade-off intuitively. Perhaps what appears to us as stagnation was restraint, a decision to live within thresholds rather than push against them. If so, modern civilization's defining trait, acceleration, may also be its greatest vulnerability. This does not require romanticizing the past. Ancient worlds were harsh. Life was precarious. But precariousness teaches awareness. When survival depends on attention, patterns are noticed. Seasons are watched. Skies are read. Memory becomes collective rather than outsourced. Modern life insulates against this attentiveness. Systems buffer individuals from immediate consequence. Energy arrives invisibly. Food appears detached from land. Climate becomes an abstract graph rather than a lived signal. In such an environment, cycles fade from perception. The present feels continuous, even as conditions shift beneath it. The danger is not ignorance, but amnesia. When a civilization forgets that it is living inside a window, it begins to behave as though the window cannot close. Infrastructure grows rigid. Dependencies multiply. Adaptability declines. Collapse, when it arrives, feels impossible right up until it is unavoidable. Seen this way, being the seventh civilization is not a badge of progress. It is a warning disguised as a milestone. Others have stood here before, convinced they were different because they could not see the ruins beneath their foundations. They too had stories explaining why the past was primitive and the present was final. The haunting possibility is that modern humanity is repeating not just structural patterns, but psychological ones: confidence before collapse, dismissal before disruption, faith in control before loss of control. These are not moral failings. They are natural outcomes of stability prolonged beyond memory. Yet there is also a quiet opportunity hidden here. Unlike previous civilizations, the current one possesses global awareness. Instruments can detect change early. Records can persist across collapse if designed to. Memory need not vanish entirely. The question is whether awareness arrives in time to matter. This brings the focus back to inheritance. If earlier worlds failed to pass down complete memory, perhaps because conditions prevented it, then the responsibility now is different. To recognize cycles without surrendering to them. To build with fragility in mind rather than denying it. Whether this responsibility will be accepted remains uncertain. Civilizations rarely choose restraint voluntarily. They are usually forced into it by circumstance. Still, the fact that the pattern can now be articulated at all suggests a shift. Awareness, even partial, alters outcome. As this part draws to a close, the unresolved tension does not demand action. It demands reflection. If humanity is not the first, and not immune, then the present moment is neither beginning nor end. It is a passage, and passages, once recognized, invite a different kind of attention. Not the confidence of arrival, but the care of travelers who understand that the ground beneath them has carried many before and will carry many again. With the inheritance acknowledged, another assumption begins to loosen quietly. It is the belief that progress moves in one direction, forward, upward, away from scarcity and toward mastery. This belief has become so familiar that it often goes unnamed, yet it shapes nearly every modern interpretation of the past. The unresolved tension now presses against this idea itself, asking whether progress, as commonly imagined, is a misunderstanding born from selective memory. When historians chart development, they tend to follow visible markers. Tools become more complex, cities grow larger, communication accelerates. These markers create the impression of ascent. But markers are not meaning. They describe capability, not sustainability. A civilization can become extraordinarily capable while simultaneously becoming less resilient. In such cases, progress masks fragility rather than eliminating it. Ancient societies appear to have intuited this distinction more readily than modern ones. Many myths frame technological overreach not as triumph, but as imbalance. Stories of forbidden knowledge, of gifts taken too soon, of civilizations punished for excess, recur across cultures. These are often interpreted morally, but they may also be practical reflections on limits discovered through experience. The idea that something can be lost through advancement is deeply uncomfortable to modern sensibility. It implies trade-offs rather than accumulation. Yet archaeology suggests that many technologies were abandoned deliberately, not because they failed, but because they destabilized social or ecological systems. Simpler methods persisted not due to ignorance, but because they endured. Consider how often complexity creates dependency. Irrigation requires maintenance. Metallurgy requires supply chains. Writing requires institutions to preserve meaning. Each layer of advancement introduces new points of failure. When conditions shift, collapse accelerates not because society lacked intelligence, but because it had too many interlocking parts to adapt quickly. Progress, then, may not be linear but oscillatory, expansion followed by contraction. Innovation followed by simplification. Each cycle carries lessons that are rarely passed on intact. Later societies inherit the tools but not the caution. The form survives, the context dissolves. This oscillation is visible even within shorter historical spans. Periods of rapid innovation are often followed by consolidation, standardization, and eventual rigidity. Once systems become optimized, they resist change. Adaptation slows. When disruption arrives, the system breaks rather than bends. From this perspective, resets are not interruptions of progress. They are part of its rhythm. They clear complexity, redistribute populations, and force reorganization at smaller scales. Afterward, innovation resumes, drawing again toward density and specialization. The cycle repeats not because of failure, but because of success carried too far. The danger lies in mistaking the peak of a cycle for its end. Civilizations at their height often believe they have solved the fundamental problems of existence. Scarcity feels temporary, risk feels manageable, the future feels owned. This confidence suppresses signals that would otherwise prompt restraint. Modern civilization is no exception. Its achievements are extraordinary. Yet many of its defining features, global interdependence, energy intensity, ecological reach, mirror patterns that historically precede instability. The difference now is scale. When collapse occurs at global scale, there is no unaffected periphery from which to recover easily. Ancient cultures often frame time as cyclical, precisely because linearity failed them. Seasons return, floods recur, stars repeat their paths. To imagine progress without return would have felt naive. The future was not an escape from the past, but its echo. Modern thought inverted this framing. History became a ladder rather than a wheel, each rung higher than the last. The past became obsolete rather than instructive. This shift allowed extraordinary acceleration, but it also removed the psychological brakes that cycles naturally impose. The question is not whether linear progress is false, it is whether it is incomplete. Progress can exist within cycles, but only if cycles are acknowledged. Without that awareness, advancement becomes blind momentum. This brings a quiet irony into focus. The civilizations we label as primitive may have been more realistic about their place in time than we are. They expected collapse. They planned for return. Their monuments often emphasize alignment and repetition rather than conquest and novelty. They measured survival in generations, not in growth curves. If this interpretation holds, then the true inheritance of previous worlds is not technology, but perspective. A recognition that permanence is an illusion and that continuity depends on adaptation rather than dominance. That what matters is not how far civilization reaches, but how gently it moves through the systems that sustain it. The unresolved tension that now carries forward is subtle. If progress is cyclical rather than linear, then the current moment cannot be evaluated by comparison to the past alone. It must be evaluated by its position within a larger rhythm. Whether modern humanity is ascending towards stability or approaching another crest before decline is not a question that can be answered definitively. But the pattern suggests that confidence itself may be the most unreliable indicator. As this thought settles, progress begins to feel less like a destination and more like a phase, a temporary configuration of energy, knowledge, and belief, one that has appeared before in other forms, and one that will likely appear again long after the present version has passed into memory or myth. When progress loosens its grip, another assumption quietly unravels alongside it. The idea that complexity equals superiority begins to feel less stable. What replaces it is a gentler, more disquieting question: whether some societies labelled as simple were, in fact, operating with a depth of understanding that modern frameworks struggle to recognise. Anthropologists have long noted that so-called primitive cultures often possess astonishingly refined knowledge of their environments. Seasonal migrations timed to subtle, ecological signals, navigation without instruments across open ocean, medical practices derived from plants whose chemical properties would not be isolated scientifically for centuries. These capabilities are frequently explained as instinct or accumulated trial and error. Yet this explanation avoids the uncomfortable implication that such knowledge reflects long continuity rather than sudden insight. What becomes visible, when examined without condescension, is a form of intelligence optimized for survival across disruption. These societies tend to avoid heavy infrastructure. Their knowledge is portable. It lives in stories, songs, gestures, and communal memory. It does not depend on centralized storage or specialized roles that can vanish in a single generation. When catastrophe strikes, little is lost because little is externalized. This contrasts sharply with civilizations that externalize knowledge aggressively. Writing, machines, digital systems all expand capacity while simultaneously increasing vulnerability. Once knowledge leaves the body and enters systems, it requires maintenance. When maintenance fails, the knowledge becomes inert, unreadable, or inaccessible. Collapse in such contexts does not merely reduce capability, it erases memory. Earlier worlds may have learned this lesson repeatedly. What appears to us as stagnation may have been strategic restraint, a refusal to embed critical knowledge in fragile structures. Instead, understanding was woven into daily life so completely that it could survive migration, loss, and reorganization. Symbolic systems play a crucial role here. What modern observers interpret as superstition often functions as mnemonic technology. Myths encode ecological relationships. Rituals preserve timing. Taboos regulate resource use. Without formal explanation, behavior persists. The system remains stable even if participants no longer articulate why it works. This stability is often misread as lack of curiosity, yet curiosity expressed without regard for consequence is a luxury of stability. Cultures that have lived through disruption tend to value continuity over novelty. Innovation is not rejected outright, but it is absorbed slowly, tested against lived experience, and abandoned if it threatens balance. Modern civilization, by contrast, prizes disruption as virtue. Innovation is celebrated for its speed rather than its endurance. Systems are replaced rather than integrated. Knowledge accumulates faster than wisdom can contextualize it. This mismatch creates a strange inversion, a society rich in information but poor in long-term memory. The danger here is not technological advancement itself. It is the erosion of embodied understanding. When tools become opaque, users become dependent without comprehension. Skills atrophy. Awareness narrows. The environment becomes background rather than partner. In such conditions, early warning signals of instability are easily ignored. Ancient societies that survived multiple resets may have prioritized perception over power. They watched cycles. They noticed recurrence. They designed social structures that could flex rather than dominate. Their knowledge was not universal, but it was durable. This durability leaves few traces that modern archaeology can easily interpret. Stone endures, stories drift, practices vanish without leaving artifacts. As a result, what survives appears minimal compared to the visible remains of urban civilizations. The absence is misinterpreted as lack rather than choice. Yet this absence aligns with the broader pattern of resets. What survives collapse is not what was most impressive, but what was most adaptable. Civilizations that tied their identity to monuments and machines left ruins. Those that tied their identity to relationships and memory left descendants. If this is acknowledged, then the narrative of human advancement shifts again. Progress is no longer measured solely by output or scale, but by continuity. A civilization that persists quietly across upheaval may be more successful, in an evolutionary sense, than one that reaches extraordinary heights only to vanish. This reframing challenges deeply held values. It suggests that the markers modern society celebrates, speed, expansion, accumulation, may be signals of fragility rather than strength. It suggests that wisdom might look unspectacular, even invisible to those trained to equate significance with spectacle. The unresolved tension now becomes intimate. If earlier societies carried knowledge differently, then the question is not what they lacked, but what we have abandoned. In pursuing mastery, what forms of awareness have been traded away? In externalizing memory, what capacity for perception has been dulled? These questions do not demand a return to the past. They ask for recognition. Recognition that intelligence can take many forms, that civilization is not a single trajectory, but a landscape of strategies shaped by experience. As this part fades, the image that remains is not of ruins or monuments, but of people moving lightly through a world they know will not always be stable. Their knowledge leaves few marks, yet it persists through living continuity rather than material permanence. If such strategies allowed humanity to endure previous resets, then their absence now may be more consequential than their simplicity ever was. And this absence, barely noticed amid abundance, may yet shape how the current cycle is remembered, or whether it is remembered at all. As the idea of hidden resilience settles, another layer quietly opens. It concerns not how civilizations end, but how they redefine what it means to be human each time they begin again. The unresolved tension now turns toward identity itself. After every reset, something more than cities and tools appears altered. The concept of the human seems to shift, subtly but persistently. Biological evolution moves slowly, but cultural evolution does not wait. In the aftermath of catastrophe, survival reshapes values with ruthless efficiency. Traits once celebrated become liabilities. New virtues emerge, not from philosophy, but from necessity. Cooperation intensifies. Hierarchies flatten or harden. The boundary between individual and group shifts, sometimes toward solidarity, sometimes toward control. Ancient mythologies often encode these transitions as changes in human nature. The people of earlier ages are described as different beings altogether. Giants, demigods, long-lived ancestors, or morally distinct races. These descriptions are usually dismissed as metaphor or exaggeration. Yet they may reflect something more grounded. Not biological difference, but experiential difference. A humanity shaped by a different world behaves differently enough to feel like another species in memory. Consider longevity myths. Pre-flood figures who live for centuries are often treated as symbolic. But longevity can also describe social continuity rather than individual lifespan. In stable conditions, knowledge accumulates across generations within living memory. Elders become libraries. When catastrophe intervenes, this continuity fractures. Lifespans feel shorter not because bodies change, but because memory no longer spans far enough to feel deep. After resets, societies often redefine what it means to live well. Simplicity becomes virtue. Excess becomes taboo. Moral systems tighten around survival needs. In some cases, spiritual frameworks emerge that emphasize humility, restraint, and obedience, qualities adaptive in unstable environments. In others, warrior cultures arise, prioritizing defense and mobility. These shifts are not random. They represent recalibrations of humanity's relationship with risk. A world perceived as fragile produces cautious humans. A world perceived as abundant produces ambitious ones. Each reset adjusts perception, and perception shapes identity. Over time, these identities harden into doctrine. Later generations inherit moral frameworks without remembering the conditions that shape them. Rules persist after necessity fades. What was once adaptive becomes constraining. Humanity begins to chafe against inherited limits, pushing outward again. This cycle suggests that resets are not merely environmental events, they are psychological reboots. Each one clears accumulated assumptions and forces humanity to renegotiate its place in the world. The danger lies not in the reset itself, but in forgetting why certain values emerged afterward. Modern humanity lives within values shaped by the most recent recovery period. Beliefs about growth, mastery, and individual agency arose in a relatively stable climatic window. These beliefs feel universal, but they are contingent. They reflect a moment when expansion was rewarded rather than punished. If conditions shift, these values may become maladaptive. Individualism may fracture cohesion. Efficiency may erode resilience. Innovation may outrun comprehension. In such moments, societies often respond by redefining humanity again, sometimes toward cooperation, sometimes toward control. History shows that these redefinitions can be gentle or violent. Some cultures adapt gradually, absorbing new constraints into worldview. Others impose change through force, redefining acceptable behavior rapidly. In both cases, the human experience narrows or expands to fit circumstance. This raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps each civilization reset is accompanied by a selective pressure not just on survival, but on identity. Certain ways of being human persist because they endure disruption. Others vanish because they require stability to function. If so, then the humanity that emerges after each reset is not identical to the one before. It carries different instincts, different fears, different hopes. Over deep time, these shifts accumulate, not genetically, but culturally, creating the illusion of linear evolution, where there is actually adaptation to recurring loss. This reframing challenges the idea of a single human story. Instead, there are versions, each shaped by what had to be endured, each convinced in its own time that its understanding of the world is final. The present moment may represent another such version, a humanity optimized for speed, connection, and scale. These traits have enabled extraordinary reach. They have also concentrated risk. The same networks that empower coordination can propagate failure globally. The same technologies that extend agency can amplify harm. If a reset were to occur now, the identity that follows would likely differ sharply from the current one. Values would shift. Assumptions would collapse. Future humans might look back on this era with the same mixture of awe and incomprehension we reserve for lost worlds. This is not a prediction. It is a pattern observed in hindsight. Each civilization believes it has discovered the true nature of humanity. Each forgets that nature is, in part, shaped by circumstance. The unresolved question that drifts forward now is quiet but profound. If humanity is redefined after each reset, then what aspects of the current identity are temporary? Which values persist because they are resilient, and which persist only because conditions have not yet challenged them? And if awareness of this pattern can exist before disruption rather than after, then perhaps the next redefinition need not be forced by loss. Perhaps it could be chosen, deliberately, in recognition of the cycles that have shaped every human world before this one. At this stage of the journey, the question no longer presses against stone, climate, or identity. It turns inward, toward something more elusive and more fragile than any monument, memory itself. The unresolved tension now asks not what happened, or even why, but how anything survives being remembered at all. Memory is often treated as storage, a vault, a container that holds events intact until they are retrieved. Yet both individual and collective memory behave very differently. They blur, they simplify, they reshape experience to fit meaning. Over time, memory does not preserve the past, it negotiates with it. Civilizations, like people, remember selectively. Trauma is softened or mythologized. Success is exaggerated. Failure is reframed as destiny or error. What cannot be integrated is often forgotten, not intentionally, but because it resists coherence. This is not deception. It is survival. A society overwhelmed by unresolved memory can't function. After each reset, memory becomes especially unstable. Too much is lost too quickly. Survivors must decide what to carry forward. In such moments, memory compresses. Complex histories are reduced to archetypes. Events become symbols. The flood becomes a story not because details were unimportant, but because details were impossible to preserve. Over generations, these symbols harden. They acquire moral weight. They define identity. What began as lived experience becomes sacred narrative. Questioning it feels like betrayal, not because it is false, but because it holds a society together. This transformation from memory to myth is often treated as degradation. Yet it may be the only way memory survives collapse at all. Precise records require stability. Myths endure chaos. They trade accuracy for longevity. In doing so, they preserve pattern rather than data. The danger arises when later societies mistake myth for origin rather than residue. When stories intended as warnings are interpreted as creation. When cycles become beginnings. In these moments, memory stops pointing backward and begins to point inward, reinforcing identity rather than caution. Modern civilization prides itself on precise memory. Archives, databases, recordings. Nothing, it seems, need ever be lost again, yet this confidence may be misplaced. Precision increases fragility. Formats become obsolete. Context evaporates. Meaning depends on systems that may not endure. A digital archive without electricity is silent. A written language without readers is inert. A record without cultural continuity becomes indecipherable. In this sense, modern memory is vast but brittle. It has not been tested by true discontinuity. Earlier civilizations may have understood this intuitively. By encoding memory into ritual, story, and environment, they ensured that even partial survival preserves something essential. A child hearing a story does not need to know its origin to absorb its lesson. Memory persists through participation rather than reference. This participatory memory creates a different relationship to truth. Truth is not a static account, but a lived orientation. It guides behavior without requiring explanation. When conditions change, the story changes with them, preserving relevance at the cost of precision. Modern thought often resists this fluidity. It seeks fixed accounts, authoritative versions, definitive histories. Yet the deeper one looks, the more history dissolves into interpretation. Competing narratives coexist. Certainty fragments. Memory reveals itself not as a mirror, but as a lens. This realization is unsettling because it destabilizes authority. If memory is negotiable, then no account is final. The past becomes open to reinterpretation, not endlessly, but cyclically. Each generation remembers what it needs to remember. In this light, the idea of 6 previous resets is not a claim about count. It is an observation about forgetting, about how many times humanity has been forced to rebuild memory from fragments. Each time, the shape of what was remembered differed. Each time, something essential was lost. The present moment may be unique not because it is advanced, but because it is self-aware. The possibility that memory itself is cyclical has entered collective thought. The idea that history may not be a straight line but a recurring negotiation between loss and meaning is no longer confined to myth. Yet awareness alone does not guarantee preservation. Knowing that memory fades does not prevent fading. It only changes how fading is understood. The question becomes whether modern civilization can design memory that survives its own disruption without collapsing into myth alone. This would require humility, a willingness to accept that no record is permanent, that meaning matters more than detail, that future readers may not care about names and dates, but about patterns of error and resilience. As this part settles, memory begins to feel less like a possession and more like a responsibility. Not to remember everything, but to remember what matters when everything else falls away. The unresolved tension that drifts forward now is gentle but insistent. If memory is shaped by survival, then what is being remembered now is already preparing the next world. Whether that world will inherit caution or confidence depends not on what is recorded, but on what is lived deeply enough to be remembered without record at all. By now, the past no longer feels distant. It leans close, almost uncomfortably so. The unresolved tension that has been building does not ask what ended before, but whether the present is quietly arranging itself in familiar ways. The question turns toward now, not as climax, but as prelude. Modern civilization often speaks of crisis in fragments, economic instability here, environmental stress there, social fragmentation somewhere else. Each issue is discussed in isolation, managed within its own framework, measured against short-term thresholds. Yet viewed from a longer rhythm, these signals begin to align, not as prophecy, but as pattern. Complex systems behave predictably when pushed beyond certain limits. They do not fail evenly. They cascade. A disruption in one domain amplifies stress in another. Feedback loops accelerate. Solutions create new problems faster than they resolve old ones. The system does not collapse because it is weak, but because it is too optimized to adapt. Earlier civilizations encountered similar dynamics, though at smaller scales. Agricultural intensification strained soil. Urban density strained sanitation. Bureaucracy strained flexibility. Each innovation solved immediate challenges while introducing delayed vulnerabilities. When conditions shifted, adaptation lagged behind reality. What feels different now is scope. Globalization has bound disparate regions into a single system. Resources, information, and risk circulate at unprecedented speed. There is efficiency in this integration, but also brittleness. Local failures no longer remain local. Disturbance propagates. Climate, once background, has become participant. Not as enemy, but as variable reasserting influence. Shifts that once unfolded over centuries now register within decades. Ecological margins narrow. Buffer zones shrink. The room for error contracts. At the same time, faith in control remains strong. Technological solutions promise mitigation. Models project outcomes. Policies are drafted. These efforts are not misguided. They are necessary. Yet they also reflect an underlying assumption that the system can be tuned indefinitely without changing its fundamental trajectory. This assumption mirrors those held by civilizations before major resets. Confidence persists until it cannot. The moment of recognition arrives late, not because warnings were absent, but because they were interpreted within frameworks that could not imagine systemic change. There is also a psychological dimension. Modern identity is deeply entwined with continuity. Careers, institutions, and narratives assume a stable future. To seriously entertain the possibility of a large-scale disruption feels destabilizing, even irresponsible. And so, uncertainty is managed rhetorically rather than structurally. Ancient societies often approached uncertainty differently. They expected instability. Their cosmologies made room for endings. Their rituals rehearsed loss. This did not make collapse painless, but it made it imaginable. Imagination, in this context, is not fantasy. it is preparation. Modern civilization rehearses progress. It practices expansion. It imagines futures that resemble the present, only improved. Futures that diverge radically, simpler, slower, constrained, are framed as failure rather than adaptation. This narrows the range of possible responses. The danger is not that collapse is inevitable, it is that imagination is constrained. When a society cannot envision transformation without loss of identity, it resists transformation until loss is forced upon it. Seen through the lens of previous resets, the present appears poised at a familiar threshold. Complexity high, dependency deep, confidence strong, memory of fragility faint. These conditions do not guarantee collapse, but they echo those that preceded it elsewhere. Yet there is also divergence. Never before has a civilization possessed such comprehensive awareness of its own vulnerability. Data flows constantly. Historical patterns are studied openly. The concept of civilizational cycles is no longer fringe. It circulates, debated and reframed within mainstream thought. This awareness creates a narrow opening, a chance, however uncertain, to respond differently, not by preventing change entirely, but by shaping how it unfolds, by choosing adaptation before rupture, by redefining success in terms of resilience rather than growth. Such choices are difficult because they challenge entrenched interests and identities. They ask for moderation in a culture built on acceleration. They ask for patience in a system rewarded by speed. They ask for collective responsibility in a framework that privileges individual gain. Previous civilizations likely faced similar crossroads, though with less clarity and fewer options. They responded according to the limits of their time. The present has different limits and different possibilities. The unresolved tension here is not a prediction of doom. It is a recognition of position. The present sits within a long rhythm, neither first nor last. What follows depends less on external forces than on internal response. As this part draws towards silence, the image that lingers is not of collapse, but of choice suspended, a moment where paths diverge quietly, without announcement. One path continues acceleration, trusting that ingenuity will outrun consequence. The other slows, listens and adjusts, uncertain of outcome but aware of pattern. History does not declare which path is taken until long after the fact. For those living within it, the present always feels normal, even as it tilts, and so the question that carries forward is gentle, almost whispered. Not whether this civilization will end, but how it will choose to live knowing that endings have come before, and that recognition itself is something no previous world held quite so clearly. When the journey reaches this quiet edge, there is no sense of arrival, only a widening stillness, like standing at night beside a body of water whose depth cannot be seen. The unresolved tension that remains no longer seeks explanation. It asks for orientation, not where humanity came from, but how it wishes to be remembered when the present becomes another layer of sediment. If this is indeed a seventh configuration of civilization, then it exists not as a culmination, but as a question posed to the future. Previous worlds left behind stone, story, and silence. They did not intend to become myths. They simply endured until they could not, and then passed through forgetting. What survived of them was not chosen by intent but by resilience. The haunting thought is that memory does not preserve the most advanced, the most powerful, or the most ambitious. It preserves what can endure interruption, what can travel lightly across loss, what can be reassembled when context vanishes. In this sense, civilization is not judged by what it builds at its height, but by what remains intelligible after it falls. Modern humanity has poured its meaning into complexity, into systems so vast that no single person understands them fully, into records so precise that they require constant maintenance, into identities tied to continuity itself. These achievements are extraordinary, They are also fragile in ways earlier societies may have recognized instinctively. If a future reset were to occur, what would remain legible? Satellites would fall silent. Digital archives would darken. Cities would decay into materials whose purpose would be unclear. Names, dates, and intentions would blur quickly. What would survive would not be the totality of knowledge, but fragments shaped by chance. Perhaps a few structures would endure, stripped of context. Perhaps some stories would persist, retold without understanding. Perhaps patterns of behaviour would linger in descendants who no longer remember why they act as they do. The future would reconstruct meaning from residue, just as the present reconstructs the past. This is not a failure of preservation, it is its natural limit. Memory cannot defeat time, it can only negotiate with it. Each civilization, knowingly or not, chooses what it offers to that negotiation. What feels different now is awareness, the recognition that cycles exist, that resets have happened before, that progress does not immunize against fragility. This awareness does not grant control, but it alters posture. It introduces the possibility of intentional humility. To live with this awareness is not to abandon ambition, it is to temper it, to recognize that the question is not how far civilization can go, but how gently it can pass through change, how much wisdom can be carried without relying on permanence. In earlier worlds, this wisdom was encoded indirectly, in myth, ritual, proportion, and taboo. Those forms were not mistakes. They were solutions shaped by experience. They traded clarity for survival. They allowed memory to persist when explanation could not. The present has the option to learn from this without repeating it blindly, to design knowledge that is robust to loss, to value adaptability alongside innovation, to practice remembering in ways that do not depend entirely on systems that require constant stability. Whether this option will be taken remains uncertain. Civilizations rarely choose restraint while momentum remains strong. Awareness often arrives before action, not during it. Still, the fact that the pattern can be named at all suggests a narrowing gap between recognition and response. If humanity is remembered as the seventh civilization, it will not be because it counted itself as such. It will be because those who come after sense a break, a before and an after. They will interpret what remains through their own needs, just as we have done. Perhaps they will find evidence of care, of attempts to balance reach with responsibility, or perhaps they will see only excess and wonder why limits were ignored despite knowledge of consequence. Their judgment will be shaped less by our intentions than by our residue. As the thought settles, the image that emerges is simple. A light moving across a dark landscape, briefly illuminating patterns in the ground before passing on. Each civilization casts such a light. None hold it forever. What matters is not how bright it burns, but whether it reveals the shape of the terrain enough for the next travellers to recognize where they are. The story does not end here. It does not conclude. It softens into quiet, into the understanding that history is not a line written once, but a surface written over many times, each inscription faintly visible beneath the next. And somewhere, beneath the present moment, the traces of earlier worlds remain, not demanding belief, only offering a reminder, whispered across time, that nothing built to last ever truly does, and that awareness of this truth may be the most enduring inheritance any civilization can leave behind.